It seems like the entrance doorbells have tapered off a little bit.
Okay.
So thank you guys all so much for coming. My name is Layla Joyce. I'm one of the co-organizers of Explorations in Archaeology. Beth Potter is the other co-organizer. We are really, really excited to have Dr. Brian Wygal with us today. Dr. Wygal is an associate professor of anthropology and the director of environmental studies and sciences at Adelphi University in New York. His research interests include environmental archaeology, deglaciation and human colonization, human ecology, and technological organization. Prior to organizing Adelphi, he was an archaeologist for the Bureau of Land Management in Wyoming and the National Park Service in Alaska. His degrees in anthropology include a BS from Kansas State University, an MA from the University of Alaska Anchorage, and a PhD from the University of Nevada, Reno. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wygal. So just a couple quick things before I let Dr. Wygal start speaking. So we're going to ask that everybody stays muted during the talk. That way we don't end up with kind of weird feedback or echoes or anything. And then there'll be time for questions afterwards. You can submit your questions in the chat and we'll make sure that they get read. And then once we're through the questions in the chat, we'll go into additional questions that people may have, at which point you can unmute yourself and ask your question. But for the meantime, keep yourself muted, and Dr. Wygal, thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Bethany and Layla, for inviting me. And it's really a pleasure to join you guys there. And Lawrence, I know you're probably scattered out, but you know, I grew up in Kansas. I went to K-State Manhattan, but I spent a lot of time in Lawrence. A lot of my friends were there, and I know that town very well. It's been quite a while since I visited, but it feels like I'm there with you. And I wished we could go out to Mass Street after this talk and have a drink or something. But happy to share with you the work I've been doing, late Pleistocene archaeology in Alaska, in Beringia, and you know, worked throughout the week to put together kind of a unique talk for you guys, and trying to think what you might be interested in your program there at the University of Kansas. And I think you'll find this really interesting. You know, we're kind of left out alone in Alaska for the most part in terms of archaeology, and sometimes I feel like it doesn't really translate to the lower 48 as well as it should. So I'll do the best I can here in the next 30 minutes to kind of walk you through some of the questions and key points of the basics of late Pleistocene archaeology in Beringia. If my slides will work here. So first of all, let me just say that I'm presenting to you from Adelphi University, which is located on Shawanaki or Wampanoag and Paumanaki, translated loosely as the island of shells or Long Island. I'm actually up on the Hudson River here, about 10 miles north of New York City, but the campus is down on Long Island. My field research takes place on Dene land, Athabascan land, at Debide Na or Sheephorn Creek along the Tanana River or Tithya Itu, the major river. And here you can see a picture of the Tanana Valley lowlands, and in the background is Hasatat Aldi or Mount Hayes. And I apologize for my pronunciations. I don't speak Algonquian or Athabascan. But this is the traditional lands of the people that we're studying. They're the descendant communities of the first peoples to cross over from Asia into Beringia. And so that's the subject really of what we're talking about. And we're talking about a landmass at the end of the Pleistocene, obviously, that formed a land bridge when sea levels were lower. Ice was locked up in continental ice sheets. And it's kind of the reverse problem we have today of rising sea levels. Sea levels are about 300 meters lower than they are today, so that shallow Bering and Chukchi Sea were exposed. We're not sure if the first Americans came along a coastal route or through an interior corridor. The evidence, as we'll see here, the evidence is not really there in the ground for either route right now, so that's up in the air. But we're talking about Beringia between 13 and 15,000 years ago, Very different world back then. Most of you are probably familiar with all the different ice age fauna that were going around. We think of this as a mammoth steppe, or sort of a dryish grassland. This mural is painted by Joe Venus, who is a Utah artist, so it reflects more of the Utah landscape. There'd been fewer trees up in Beringia, especially by 15,000 years ago. And by the end of this period, 13,000 years ago, you'd see more trees, poplar and willow, starting as we get closer to the Younger Dryas. So climate changes are a big part of this. And in this presentation, I want to talk about the different lithic toolkits that we see in some of the different sites, archaeological sites that exist, and what that means for the Pleistocene peopling of the Western Hemisphere in general. So we're talking about the first people really to have crossed from Asia into the Americas. These are people that were descended from, and Jennifer Rath summarizes very well in the archaeological record from last year, where she was summarizing the literature, and she states, quote, that they are descended from an East Asian group that separated from its parental population approximately 36,000 years ago. And then an article by Brahe. Most archaeologists now believe the first Americans traversed the ice-free corridor or a Pacific coastal route, or both, during the terminal Pleistocene. And they go on to say in that article that this is basically settled fact that people came in during the coastal migration. So while this is a diplomatic opening to this 2020 paper, they go on to say that essentially there is a pre-Clovis occupation of the lower 48, and they arrived through a coastal trail, which I don't agree with. I don't think this is settled fact. And I think when you see the evidence from Alaska, from Eastern Beringia itself, I think you'll agree with my position on this. But the question is, was there a coastal or was there an inland migration? And then is there any archaeological evidence for this hypothesized Beringian standstill, which I'll explain here in a moment. And for this presentation, we want to look at, can lithic technology help us to identify multiple waves of people? There's not a lot of human remains from the late Pleistocene, so there are a few cases where DNA have been extracted from human remains that are much later than, say, 13 or 14,000 years. The Upward River Sun infant burials that Ben Potter has been working on, they really date to the end of the Pleistocene and are early Holocene in age. So we're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 years after some of the first people had arrived, that those genomes give us a snapshot for. Nonetheless, it's interesting, it's useful information, but none of this is settled fact, I think, in at least my mind and many Alaskan archaeologists in general. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about this Beringian standstill. There's neighboring populations in Siberia. They move into this land mass up north. We know they're at the Arctic Circle, or pretty far north at 36,000 years ago at the Yana site. And according to the genetic data, they're isolated there, and founder effect takes hold, but they're kind of stuck in this area because this ice sheet, sorry if my mouse is kind of in the way there, this ice sheet is blocking them. They can't really go down the coast, and they can't really go through the interior. And so they're stuck in this zone. Now, in the meantime, by 24,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum occurs, and that pushes most people across Europe, across all of the old world and Siberia. We think it kind of pushes them south. But for some reason, people may still be in Beringia, and that may have been the climatic episode that cut them off, where they then formulate the population genome that becomes that derives the descended communities of all American Indians that eventually migrate south. So the question is, what's going on in Beringia during all this time? And do we have any evidence of the standstill that can help us understand that? Tightly constrained, the standstill probably occurred after the LGM, 21,000 to 16 or 17,000. There's no archaeology in this region that can pin people to the ground, at least definitely not in Eastern Beringia, and there's not much in the Russian Far East until about 18,000 years ago in terms of like archaeological evidence of people there. It doesn't mean they weren't there, it means we haven't found evidence of them in the ground yet. But some of these genomic papers that are out are arguing for 3 to 4 founding lineages that may have come up into Beringia and then, I guess, melded together to form the Native American founding lineages. So we're talking about the first people, and Beringia is key to this story. It's key to understanding the peopling of the Americas. There may have been a long period of diversification where groups are mingling and mixing in this area. It's really unclear where they were during the height of the last glacial maximum. Possibly they're in south central Beringia and these places that are now underwater. But what we can say from an archaeological standpoint is that there is no physical evidence of anyone in eastern Beringia before 14,100 years ago, at least not right now. That's not to say it doesn't exist. There's a lot of Alaska that's been unsurveyed, a lot of wilderness there. And the sites that we do have, as I'll show you, are kind of pretty far into eastern Beringia, and they didn't just magically drop in there. There had to have been source populations that they originated from. So that kind of sets the stage. Part of this story, of course, are these ice sheets, and we don't have a firm grasp on the timing of their retreat. But that's part of this story. So looking at the archaeological sites, there are some key sites here. These are early sites. We do have 3 sites that have components that are older than 14,000 years, about 14,100 years. Swan Point, the most famous Swan Culture Zone Fort, Swan Point. A couple sites you may not have heard of, McDonald Creek, which is not in Shaw Creek, but it's next to Shaw Creek. It's in the Tanana Valley. And then the Holtzman South site, which is a site that I've been excavating with a large team of people in the Tanana Valley there. And you can kind of see the blow up map, which has where the glaciers would have approximately been at about 14,000 to 13,000 years ago. And you can see the red dots indicate these sites that are older than 14,000. There's a whole bunch of sites that are Clovis age or close to Clovis age in the Tanana Valley and in the Nenana Valley here. And so we'll talk about the Tanana Valley, Shaw Creek area in a little more depth, well, about 1.5 meters in depth to be specific. And we'll talk a little bit about the Nenana Valley over here, just in terms of the different lithics that assemblages that we see and what they might mean. So I want to talk about lithic technology. As archaeologists, we like to classify things into groups and categorize them into typologies. And for a long time, we would magically say that these complexes, techno-complexes that we assign, never really outright say it, but we like to imply that that represents a culture, archaeological culture. When in actual, fact, we know that people are perfectly capable of switching technologies, vary their technologies for different reasons and circumstances, but that's a little too hard for us to take into account. It's easier for us to try to call these people, well, techno-complexes, really. And from the archaeological standpoint, all we're talking about is their tools. Without, like genetic evidence from human remains or something, we can't really say if they spoke the same language, if they were the same ethnicity, or if they were related. Nonetheless, it's interesting because, people make incredibly different stone toolkits to survive in this area. So 3 that we want to talk about: Duoktai, which is straight from the upper Paleolithic of Siberia. Duoktai comes out of the Russian Far East. It only shows up at one site, one component in Alaska, and that's Swan Point. So that's a bit of an anomaly. Just right there in the middle of eastern Beringia, pretty close to the opening of the ice-free corridor. But it's a type of technology that is unique, very specific, and the only other place it shows up is in Paleolithic Siberia. So it's isolated there. Is it ancestral to the Denali complex? I'll talk about these in a little bit. In between those, in terms of time, is something called the Nenana complex, which more or less dates to a similar period as Clovis. It's questionable if it shows up in the Tananal Valley, but there are a lot of sites of that age. They just don't have the same tools as they do in the neighboring Nenana Valley. I'll show you a map here, a more close-up map here in the next slide or two. Nenana complex is really clearly stratified and defined in the Nenana Valley, however. So Denali complex then comes later, starts about the Younger Dryas. It's very widespread, highly variable, and there's significant overlap. So it's like this explosion of people that kind of spread out all across the state. It's a lot of new things that, if you're not familiar with Alaskan archaeology, get confusing quite quickly. But you know, to kind of summarize, in the Nenana Valley, Nenana complex is down low at about 13,000, and it's stratified, and above that is the Denali complex. So John Hofecker and Roger Powers said this pretty clearly shows one group of people living there during the Allarod warm period. They didn't make microblade technology. They used these small triangular points, and then time goes by, people go away, and later the Denali complex comes in, and they're different people. They use a different technology. They have microblades, different kinds of tools. So it looked like in the early 1990s that this was the clear picture of the culture history of Alaska. Until Chuck Holmes was digging in the Tananal Valley around the corner and finds these Chindaden-like points at a time period that would normally be Denali, and he finds microblades earlier than the Nenana in the Nenana Valley. So they're like flip-flopped. The two valleys have totally reversed cultural sequences almost. And so Holmes comes up with his own category of culture history. Hofecker, Powers come up with theirs, and it kind of remains unresolved for quite a long time. Still, in many ways, still unresolved. I think we just kind of got tired of talking about it in Alaska. But if we look at this in time and against the climate correlation, Deoktai shows up during a cold snap, the oldest, driest period, but more or less it's a general warm period surrounded by warm times. So it's hard to say, is Deoktai a cold adaptation, or do they arrive during a warm period? With only one component, it's hard to say. But there's a lot of space in terms of the chronology between Deoktai and the later Nenana that shows up also during a warmer period after the older Dryas. And Nenana overlaps with Denali complex, so you can kind of see them in time here. And I really associate Denali complex microblade technology of Denali complex with the Younger Dryas showing up at about 12,800 and then really kind of exploding across the state very quickly. The question is, because Deoktai and Denali both make microblades, are they related? Is one descended from the other? And then the other question is, what is Nenana? Why did they just suddenly, for 1,000 years or more, forget how to make microblades? So it doesn't make a lot of sense unless we're talking about, are these different groups of people that just do lithics differently? Maybe we're talking about 3 different groups of people here that approach lithic technological organization in fundamentally different ways. The other option is that it's a seasonal thing, and they're doing one thing in the summer and a different thing in the winter, which is also a viable possibility. So I'll quickly kind of go through this. Deoktai complex, 14,100, 13,500 at Swan Point. It's a Siberian Paleolithic technology. They're making these microblades, which are intended to inset into bone tools. Very sophisticated, specific stone tool technology. A lot of people argue it's ancestral to the later Denali complex, but keep in mind there's a 1,000-year gap. Nenana complex looks a little bit like this: teardrop, triangular shape, projectile points. They're pretty expedient. These are not sophisticated bifaces. There's no microblades in Nenana. There's both a very broad definition of Nenana, which includes all of interior Alaska, and then there's a very limited definition that I think Hofecker and maybe Ted Gable approve of, which is limited only to the Nenana Valley where it was originally found. It's nowhere south of the Alaska Range. You don't find it in alpine zones, so it is sort of limited in terms of space. And the map kind of looks like this. You can see Swan Point is here. The kind of looks like a blue eyeball, and all the red diamond shapes are Nenana complex sites. If we take the broad definition of these teardrop shape, they're called Chindaden points, and that kind of lengthens the time period that Nenana would kind of existed. But these would be the earliest toolkits in interior Alaska along the Tanana River, and the Nenana is here where it kind of feeds in. So you can see how it's a neighborhood, right? This is an ecological zone that people would have been hunting mammoths in. The Alaska Range would have still been fairly glaciated. Denali emerges during the Younger Dryas. Microblade technology, a wide variety of bifaces, so it's not like they lack that. In fact, they're lanceolate bifaces, and if you put a flute on that, it might look like Clovis. Wide variety of tools, very diverse toolkit, very sophisticated. Different kinds of tools for doing different kinds of tasks. These are very well adapted people, and they spread across Alaska. We don't know where they originate. So if we look at Denali complex, one thing that is confusing about this period is you'll have Denali complex sites that only have the bifaces or microblades aren't present. You'll have Denali complex sites that have the microblades there. So it's not alone a diagnostic trait for the toolkit that there are microblades. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out why they have microblades and why they don't. And I want to kind of tell you a little bit about why I think that is. If we look at just looking at Denali complex, because it may help us understand this, elevation seems to be a factor. If we use elevation, it's one of the things that did not change from late Pleistocene. The vegetation changed, fauna changed, elevation and rivers and streams are for the most part the same as they were at this time. So elevation is a significant factor. You see the most diverse toolkits in montane zones, where you get all kinds of different tools in these areas. Microblades are very rare above 800 meters, but bifaces are not. I don't know of any microblades above 1,000 meters in Alaska. So here you can see where microblades are present. They show up quite often in the lowlands. They show up occasionally in the montane areas. You might get big lithic workshops with microblades in montane areas. You don't see any in really in the far uplands. And then, so those are sites with them present and sites with them absent, where you do see bifaces in the uplands. And so it kind of looks like this. This is just a database of all microblade known sites. And keep in mind that microblades persist until 1,000 years ago. So some of these sites may not be late Pleistocene in age, but microblade technology really kind of spreads across eastern Beringia. So we know that Denali is highly variable, presence, absence of microblade technology, and it seems to kind of be contrary between the Nenana, Greater Broad Pass is more or less the Nenana Valley area and the Tanana Valley area. And in this chart, you can see they're almost opposite of each other of what's going on. And so this kind of gets me thinking, maybe there's a seasonal migration here, and microblades are a cold weather tool and bifaces are a warm weather tool. And that's sort of the hypothesis that, I've been working on for, I guess, 10 years or more. And so analyzing these things, what I found on sort of a larger scale, you can see I've divided this chart up by elevation, upland and montane and lowland, where they're present and where they're absent. And it does suggest that above 800 meters, you don't see very many microblades at all. And there seems to be some sort of significance when you associate this presence and absence dichotomy with elevation. Now, someday somebody may find a microblade or a microblade core at 1,000 meters and prove me wrong, but they haven't yet, and they've been trying. People have been looking. So let's kind of look at the Tanana Valley, though. This is where the early stuff is and where it's deeply stratified and well-preserved fauna. While present there is very limited microblade use, actually, compared to like montane zones. So we don't find them at high elevations. You don't find a lot of them down in the Tanana Valley. Like we've excavated a lot of sites from the late Pleistocene, trying to replicate what Chuck found at Swan Point, Diocti especially. And we have not been able to find a lot of microblades in those first early people sites. Even during the Younger Dryas, you do find some microblades, but again, they're not super common, and you find them with Nenana-like projectile points. So now you have Nenana, the diagnostic artifact of Nenana complex and the diagnostic artifact of Denali complex, and they're together in one assemblage. So what is going on with this? Are these one people? Is it a late manifestation of Nenana complex that comes out of the Nenana Valley and they intermingle with people in the Tanana Valley? Is this a merging of technological traditions, or is it like a complete failure of archaeologists in our typological classifications? So Shaw Creek, it may hold the key to all this. Lots of important early sites. If I've taken the earliest dates from a lot of these sites along Shaw Creek. The Holtzman site is the one I've been excavating. Broken Mammoth has this flat date here, right at the transition from the Alrod, which is a warm period, to the Younger Dryas, which is a cool period. And this is where we would expect to find Nenana. And down here we have Diocti at Swan Point, and then the rest of it. This date is kind of flat and a little disturbing. It's not a great date. And if you take it away, then you get a temporal gap between the two, like different phases or different waves, like 300-400 years at least where nobody's around. That suggests to me that it's not cultural continuity in this area, although Chuck and Ben Potter and a lot of other people would argue that there is cultural continuity. So I don't know the answer yet. I don't know. We may find, there's a lot of things that could be going on. Radiocarbon, chronology, all kinds of things. But I see a gap right there, 300-400 years at the onset of the Younger Dryas. And not just in the Tanana Valley, but I see that across the state. It's hard to find a site that dates to 12,800 years ago. I think that's important. This is the Holtzman site. Some of you may have heard me talk about this a couple of weeks ago. I won't be too redundant with that, but we found it in 2015 and have been excavating there since. This is kind of where our excavation block lines up with the block on the hill. And it looks like this. You can see at its lower components here from 12,000 to 12,600 or so. We have component 4 with large fire hearths, a lot of big fauna, some lithics, like there's a broken inscraper and some cherts, but not a lot of lithics. You have an antler cache of caribou antlers here. So it's a rich deposit that dates to the Younger Dryas. On the right, you have component 5A, which you see it shift a little, and some classic like Ben40 and working around the hearths. A lot of lithics in this component. It's all quartz, which is really hard to work and doesn't make very good tools. Neither of these components have Chindaden points or microblades or anything diagnostic, but it's fairly typical of Shaw Creek. The lower Alrod component, which they're using the local quartz material, breaking this hard rock, and they're using it to process mammoth ivory to make tools with, organic tools out of mammoth ivory. It's almost as if they don't know where the lithic sources are. This is a local material right at the base of the hill, all along Shaw Creek, and it's like that at Broken Mammoth, it's like that at Mead. For some reason, it's not quite like that at Swan Point. So we're not learning much on the lithics from here, but we're learning a lot about fauna and what they ate. Like here's a quartz heavy chopper and an anvil. They're busting up tusks. Really nice hearths. In the component 5 hearth, there's very little charcoal because there's very little trees. But they're burning something, and they're actually cooking a lot of birds. You get bird bone in that hearth. And they're collecting mammoth ivory. Doesn't necessarily mean they're hunting mammoth. They could be just collecting it, but they're using it. Now at Swan Point, there is evidence that they did kill a juvenile mammoth and they ate it. And the big question is, did they eat mammoth all the time? And the answer in my mind is no, but they used a lot of ivory. And it doesn't mean they didn't hunt mammoth. We know they overlapped. They were there at the same time. Here's a mammoth ivory rod. It dates to 13,500. And to my, this is very similar to Clovis. You'll see this in Clovis assemblages. It's one of the tools that came from this site. And there are more mammoth ivory rods from broken mammoth. This one's wedge shaped on the end. To what I understand, these are the oldest mammoth ivory rods that we know about in the Western Hemisphere, because the ones associated with Clovis tend to be more like 13,000 years old. These are about 500 years older. There's a lower component here that would be the age of the Deoktay assemblage at Swan Point, component 5B. Here you see a bison rib sticking out of the wall with a lithic tool next to it. And you notice the difference in the distribution of artifacts here. There's a mammoth tusk, and then it's sort of diffuse and spread out. And so it's not as concentrated. This is what an exploratory occupation would look like, the first people to enter the valley. Here's the bison bone and some of the lithics. We have a little bit of red ochre. Maybe 2 occupations, maybe 3, but they're not discrete artifact clusters, and that tells me quite a lot. First, the bison rib is 13,700 or so, but the charcoal stuck to one of these flakes dated to the age of the tusk as well, 14,100, 14,000, 13,900, same age as Swan Point, the Deoktay. And they're not using quartz. They have a high quality basalt and very high quality chert that they brought with them. So this is the first wave of people coming into Shaw Creek that we can tell. Now, I don't have anything diagnostic yet. I was really hoping to get back there this summer to excavate more units and explore this lower component at greater depth, learn more about this, but obviously we didn't get up there this summer, and hopefully we'll be able to go back in 2021, I guess it will be now, and try to find more. Maybe there's Deoktay down at this level as well, and we can verify and replicate the findings at Swan Point. So to kind of wrap this up here, if I may, I hope I've brought a little bit of clarity. I know it's not clear. What we can say is initial migrations occurred from the interior and not from the coast. One of the things I did not talk about is that along the coast, the Pacific Northwest coast, there are not early sites. Now, you'll get a lot of claims that there are, but they're disputed. There's no archaeology that is older than 14,000 years on the coast. And if they came down the coast, you would expect in the lower 48 that the oldest sites would be in California, and they're not. The oldest sites are in Arizona. And we can argue about all these claims of pre-Clovis, but it's probably not the right time for that. I tend to be a little more skeptical than others on this front. But what we see is the earliest sites in Eastern Beringia at the right time, at the opening of the ice-free corridor at 14,000 years ago. That evidence is there. So we know they're in the interior and they're using terrestrial animals. That's not to say they didn't go down to the coast and then come in, and we don't know which way they went. There's not evidence in either corridor. So we're looking then beyond the migration routes, we're looking at technological organization. How did they organize their lithics? Were there different cultures of people, different ethnicities of people that came together and eventually melded into one Beringian culture before then starting to move south once the ice cleared, whatever time that was? Did they base their choices for tools on elevation? And does that somehow relate to seasonality? Did they go up in the mountains for the summer and come down to the lowlands in the winter, and occupying the montane zones twice a year as they passed through? That seems reasonable. A lot of seasonal migrations in Alaska of other animals and Athabascans as well. Raw material availability, the source of the stone is important to this question. We need more fauna, we need teeth, especially in birds, especially waterfowl, to get at the seasonality question. And we're finding some of that, so we hope to learn more. The earliest occupations are clearly in the interior. We're missing certain pieces of the record, obviously. There's a lot in Alaska we don't know about. But understanding all of these behaviors eventually will help us understand when and how and from where the first people colonized Alaska. So I thank you all for your attention. I'll leave you with this we dig really big holes in Alaska for this. And list of references here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was phenomenal. That was phenomenal.
Thank you.
If people have questions, so you can type them in the chat. That's probably the easiest way to go about this. Since we don't have any questions in the chat just yet, you can absolutely unmute yourself and ask questions if that's a little bit easier.
I did get one in the chat.
Oh, I didn't even see it.
Right. So the question is, what are the microblades used for and the bifaces?
It's a good question, and people have been trying to answer it. They're probably multi-tool, a lot of different tasks. The whole purpose is that you can make your lithic material go longer. You get a lot more cutting edge out of a microblade core than you would a biface. Biface kind of wastes a lot of material. So if you're conserving your raw material, say it's winter and there wasn't a lot of snow, then it was fairly dry, but if you're far away from a lithic source and you want to conserve that and make it last as long as possible, you would make a microblade core. So think of it as a disposable razor blade, where you'll like detach the dull one and reattach a sharp one to your handle or whatever. They would inset them into bone or ivory or antler, and that created a sharp cutting edge, and then you can make a projectile out of it, you can make a knife out of it, probably lots of different uses for it. Biface is pretty clearly the ones that we are looking at are armatures on the end of a dart or a spear projectile. Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask as we go.
Hi, Brian. This is Fred today. I have a question, kind of a continuation of what you just talked about. Mm-hmm. To me, microblades and bifaces are very different, not only in terms of their function, but also in what they represent as far as the way people organize their technology. And you're carrying around different weight, you're giving yourself different options in terms of flexibility, but you also have to procure the material in a different way, because you need a much larger piece of rock to make a biface than you need to make a microblade. Mm-hmm. So I can see how microblades and bifaces could represent different seasonalities in anybody's occupation, but can you tell us a little bit more about about the dichotomy that you see, and how would they be utilizing those different ecotones or ecozones that you identify? What are they doing in those different environments?
Right. So, one of the reasons why I got on this question was when I was working for Denali Park, I was surveying high elevation places above 3,000 meters, not up in the ice caps, but just below that. And I was really amazed that I would find a lot of bifaces, preforms and manufacture, and it's pretty clear they were making stone bifaces to hunt in the uplands in the summer. Caribou or even bison back in the Pleistocene will go up in elevation to get away from bugs, and it's not as hot, and a lot of resources up there in the summer. And I was really amazed that I was not finding microblades at high elevation. And then I just started looking at the distribution of them and started to break them down by ecotones. I'm not sure that it's the perfect answer to that question, but I really started to think that maybe these are seasonal toolkits, in the fall before it really starts to turn cold and dark primarily, going into the land of the midnight sun. That still would have been the case in the Pleistocene, certainly. You don't want to be out looking for raw materials when it's dark. You want to cache and store as much good quality stone as you can to get you through until spring. So I really see it as a seasonal thing where sometimes they're being conservative with their stone tools, and so they're switching to microblades. And in the summer, they don't have to be, because if they're up in the mountains, there's a lot of raw material available to them, and they can waste however much they want. And so they can make these big projectile points. Now, they're going to carry them around too. So they're not going to just throw it away because it's fall now. I'm going to ditch my biface and pick up my microblade. They're going to move around with them too. Part of the problem is, dealing with people is they're unpredictable and they don't always follow the rules, whatever those rules are. So that's one option. The other thing is maybe it's a cold weather thing. And, as comparing it to the climate, maybe it's a climate thing. Maybe there's more microblade use during the Younger Dryas when it's really cold, like the climate is cold. It's the return to glacial conditions essentially. And that's when we see this explosion of Denali complex or a return to microblade use. I don't know, I'm just speculating. So all we can do is like dig them up in the ground and say, this is what we found, and that's where we found it, and this is how old it is. And, the function behind them. There are people that are working on use wear, and there's a dissertation defense on Friday that's about microblades and use wear and these kinds of things. I don't know that we have the answers to all those questions. They're good questions, though.
Thanks a lot. By the way, I noticed that you're wearing purple today.
I was going to have a power cat in the background, I like the clock, and I thought I should put that in the background. I actually took a class at KU from Michael Crawford. I took my biological anthropology. I took at KU. That didn't go over well at the time, I'll tell you. It worked for me, but not in my home department.
We'll welcome you back anytime.
Thanks, Dennis. I still remember Mike Finnegan slamming his fist on the desk saying, "Your blood should be purple by now." Because it was his class I was skipping out on. Anyway, it's a long story.
Brian, this is Rolf Mandel. You didn't mention Bluefish Caves.
No, I didn't.
But so what do you think about, since that's on the eastern fringe of Beringia?
It's not legit, man. I just don't buy it. And there'll be a paper coming out here. It's in press that really does, I think, put that to rest. There's not people. The Canadians don't want to hear it, but there's not people at Bluefish Cave at 24,000 years ago. They got like 2 cut marks on a couple of bones in a rock shelter that is full of rock debris. Out of thousands and thousands of bones, there's 2 cut marks. The stratigraphy is not, caves can be problematic in that sense. They're not always well stratified. So I've never bought into Bluefish Caves as being 24,000 years old. And there'll be a paper coming out in Arctic Anthropology, not by me, that I think will really poke holes in that. The bigger question is like down south there in Idaho, Cooper's Ferry, the debate's going on there, and then all these other pre-Clovis sites. If you saw the Mammoth talk a couple of weeks ago, you'll see that, hearth features, charcoal with bone and burnt bone and lithics all laid out and left in situ at 13,800 years ago. That is convincing evidence. But Paisley Caves, with all due respect to my good friend John Blong and the research they're doing there, every time they find these biomarkers that say human, they also find biomarkers that say canid. We have very similar diets. And I'm not convinced that there is a occupation of people south of the ice sheets at 15,000 years ago, simply because I don't see the evidence in Eastern Beringia that would suggest that. We've dug a lot. And so I can't say I'm not a pre-Clovis person, because we know there's people here before Clovis. We know Clovis in fluted points starts down south and moves north through the ice-free corridor, because we see it show up in Alaska at about 10,000 years ago. So there has to be, and a lot of people will hate it that I say this, there has to be a pre-Clovis occupation. The question is when. When did that occur, and how did they come into the country? I think those are the big questions. You know, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying I'm not convinced by the evidence that's there now. Sorry. It's not popular right now. Other
So we do
questions?
have one more question in the chat. So the question is, are those microblades similar to the ones used in sickles during the Neolithic era, the insertable ones new farmers used to cut the wheat or barley?
Right, the Natufians in Southwest Asia, they are very similar idea. You know, I think they call them microliths there. The manufacturer is a little bit different, but same idea, same concept. Yep, inset them into something and use it as a blade.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, other questions either in the chat or by unmuting yourself?
I do have another question, just to kind of follow up on that. Would it be possible that those microblades are used for processing any type of plant or grass?
It could be, yeah. So there isn't a lot of plants at the, I mean, it would have been sage and grasses, a steppe-like environment. Certainly any of that's possible. You know, one big question is, are they used to work leather? Like a knife, it'd be perfect razor blade to slice and cut tailored clothing and leather. There's a lot of functions that they could be used for. And I'm sure they were used for all kinds of things. Other questions? Okay, thanks, guys.
All right. Yeah, if there aren't any other questions, then Dr. Wygal, thank you so much for joining us. That was really phenomenal.
Thank you.
I'm glad we got to have a little bit of discussion afterwards. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We will see you all again, hopefully on the 28th for Dr. Catherine Pompiani's talk, Life and Death in the Bronze Age, Insights from Serbia. Our flyer will go out at some point in the next couple days, and you'll see a link for that talk like you did for this one. If you'd like to go back and watch this talk or any of our previous talks, we now have a YouTube channel.
Oh.
If you search KU Explorations in Archaeology, you will find our previous two talks and soon this one as well. So thank you all so much for joining us. Hopefully we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. That was a great talk.
Thanks, Dennis.